Snow lashed against frosted window panes while wolves howled in brutal, starving harmony. A solitary cabin stood stubbornly against winter's blinding fury. Inside, an armed man sat guard in his bitter isolation. Then, a frail, desperate knock shattered his silence. A shivering woman stood there, carrying a secret deadly enough to burn his world to ashes. Winter hit the San Juan Mountains in December of 1883 with a vengeance that locals would whisper about for decades. It was the kind of cold that snapped pine branches like dry bones and froze a man's lungs if he breathed too deep. High up on the ridge overlooking the Animas River Valley, John Montgomery sat in the dim amber glow of his hearth, a Winchester rifle resting across his knees. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, calloused, weathered, and hiding scars that ran far deeper than the jagged silver line cutting across his jaw. John had spent the last 3 years erasing himself from the world. Before the mountains, he had been a Pinkerton man, tracking train robbers and cattle rustlers from Chicago to the dusty borders of the New Mexico Territory. But a botched job in Denver, a shootout that left a young, innocent girl dead in the crossfire, had shattered his conscience. He walked away from the badge, the agency, and humanity, seeking penance in the unforgiven isolation of the Colorado high country. The blizzard had been raging for 2 days, a whiteout that buried the trails and silenced the forest. John was whittling a piece of cedar, the repetitive motion grounding him when the sound came. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind slamming dead branches against the heavy oak door. But it came again. 3 sharp, rhythmic thuds. John stopped breathing. Nobody came up this mountain in December. Nobody survived a trek up this mountain in December. He racked the lever of his Winchester, the metallic clack deafening in the quiet cabin, and approached the door. He unlatched the heavy iron bolt and pulled the door inward against the howling gale. A wall of white snow blinded him for a second, but then she fell forward, collapsing right across his threshold. John kicked the door shut with his boot, sealing the storm back outside. He looked down, his rifle still leveled. It was a woman, draped in a man's oversized wool coat that was frozen solid with a thick crust of ice. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue, her skin pale as porcelain, and her breath was a shallow, ragged rattle. She forced her head up, her trembling, frost-bitten fingers clutching the edges of her frozen collar. Her eyes, a striking shade of hazel filled with a terrifying desperation, locked onto his. "May I warm myself by your fire?" she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice over a pond. John stared at her. His instinct, honed by years of betrayals and ambushes, screamed that this was a trap. But the humanity he thought he had buried deep in the Denver dirt flared to life. "Fire's hot, coffee's bitter," John muttered, his voice gravelly from weeks of disuse. "Keep your hands where I can see them." He slung his rifle over his shoulder and knelt, scooping her up. She weighed nothing, a fragile bird caught in a hurricane. He carried her to the heavy rug in front of the stone hearth, laying her down as gently as his rough hands allowed. John went to work with mechanical efficiency. He knew the wilderness. He knew how quickly the cold claimed its victims. He stripped off her frozen outer layers, tossing the stiff, icy wool coat aside. Underneath, she wore a tailored, dark velvet riding habit, ruined by mud and snow, but undeniably expensive. John noted the fine stitching. This was no mountain woman. This was a city girl, wealth woven into every thread, which made her presence in the deadly peaks of the San Juans entirely baffling. He wrapped her in his thickest buffalo skin blanket, pulling her closer to the roaring flames. He poured a cup of black chicory coffee from the iron pot suspended over the fire, cooling it slightly with a splash of cold water, and lifted her head to help her drink. "Slow," he commanded as she choked on the bitter liquid. "Small sips. Your stomach will reject it if you rush." She nodded weakly, her shivering slowly turning into violent tremors as her body registered the return in heat. For hours, John sat in the chair opposite her, tending the fire, watching her with a hawk's vigilance. When she finally gathered enough strength to sit up, she pulled the buffalo skin tightly around her shoulders. "I thought I was going to die out there," she said, her voice finding a bit more strength. "My name is Abigail. My stagecoach was attacked down in the valley. I ran." John didn't blink. He reached over with a poker and adjusted a glowing log. "Stagecoach route was snowed in and closed by the territorial governor a week ago, Abigail," he said flatly. "And even if it wasn't, a woman running from a wreck in the valley doesn't climb 3,000 feet up a mountain in a whiteout." Her eyes widened slightly, the firelight catching a sudden flash of panic. John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your boots?" he pointed with the iron poker. "They're custom leather, made in Boston. Your dress costs more than this cabin. And when I took off your coat, I felt the weight of the double-barreled Derringer tucked into your corset. I didn't take it, because if you pull it on me, I'll put a bullet through your heart before you can cock the hammer." Silence stretched between them, heavier than the storm outside. "Who are you running from?" John asked. She stared at the flames, her jaw tightening. The fragile, desperate girl vanished, replaced by a hardened woman calculating her next move. "If I tell you the truth, you'll throw me back out into the snow." "Try me." She hesitated, then looked him dead in the eye. "I am not running from a stagecoach robbery. I am running from my husband, and if he finds me, he will kill us both." John leaned back in his wooden chair, the wood creaking in protest. A husband. Domestic disputes in the Wild West often ended in bloodshed, but they rarely involved scaling a mountain in a deadly blizzard. "Well, Abigail," John said, deciding to let the alias slide for now. "Unless your husband can walk through 10 feet of snow drifts, he ain't finding you tonight. Rest. We'll figure out what to do with you when the sky clears." For 3 agonizingly long days, the blizzard held them hostage. The wind screamed around the eaves of the cabin, piling snow halfway up the windows, sealing them in a twilight of isolation. In that forced proximity, a fragile, unspoken truce settled between John and the woman calling herself Abigail. The tension of the first night slowly thawed into a cautious domestic rhythm. John chopped firewood from his indoor stack, mended his gear, and cooked meager meals of salt pork and dried beans. Abigail, refusing to be a burden despite her lingering exhaustion, insisted on helping. She scrubbed the iron skillets, swept the rough-hewn floorboards, and organized his chaotic shelves of provisions. John watched her when she wasn't looking. He noticed the bruises on her wrists, dark, fading purple marks that told a story of violence. He noticed the way she flinched if he moved too quickly, the way she kept her back to the wall. He recognized the look of a hunted animal. He had seen it in the mirror every morning for the last 3 years. Slowly, the ice between them began to crack. On the second evening, after a dinner of hardtack and venison stew, they found themselves sitting by the hearth, the only source of light and warmth. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked, pulling her knees to her chest beneath the blanket. "Ain't had much practice lately," John replied, whittling away at his cedar block. "Why are you up here?" She gestured to the sparse, rugged cabin. "A man with your observational skills. You aren't a trapper. You hold that rifle like a man who's used to getting shot at." John paused his knife. He looked at the fire, the ghosts of Denver flickering in the flames. "I made a living hunting bad men. Turned out I wasn't much better than the men I was hunting. Up here, the only lives I can ruin are the ones dumb enough to knock on my door during a blizzard." A soft, melancholic smile touched her lips. "I don't believe you're a bad man. A bad man would have let me freeze." "A smart man would have," John countered, though the harshness had bled out of his voice. On the third day, the air in the cabin shifted. The storm outside began to break, the howling wind dying down to a low moan. Sunbeams pierced through the frosted glass, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Cabin fever was giving way to the stark reality that the world outside was waiting for them. That afternoon, Abigail was sleeping on the cot, exhausted from the lingering effects of the cold. John took the opportunity to finally dry out her heavy frozen wool coat, which had been hung near the door. As he hoisted the heavy garment closer to the fire, something heavy clunked in the deep inner pocket. John frowned. He reached his hand inside the damp wool. His fingers brushed against cold metal, pulling out a heavy, leather-bound ledger and a silver pocket watch on a thick chain. He flipped the watch over, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. Engraved on the back of the silver casing was a very specific crest, a coiled rattlesnake over a crossed pair of revolvers. It was a custom piece. He had only ever seen one like it in his entire life. It belonged to Josiah Black Eye Miller. Josiah Miller was the ruthless, cold-blooded outlaw who had orchestrated the Denver payroll heist. He was the man who had fired the wild shot that killed the innocent girl. He was the ghost John had failed to kill before fleeing into the mountains. John dropped the coat. He opened the leather ledger. The pages were filled with names, dates, payoffs to territorial judges, railroad barons, and corrupt Pinkerton supervisors. It was an empire of dirt, documented in black ink. He turned around slowly. The woman was sitting up on the cot, her eyes wide, staring at the watch and the ledger in his hands. "Abigail," John said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly whisper. "Or whatever your real name is. You have exactly 10 seconds to explain to me how you got Josiah Miller's watch and his blackmail ledger." She swallowed hard, the color draining from her face. She reached under the blanket, her hand hovering near her corset where the derringer was hidden. "Don't," John warned, his hand dropping to the heavy Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "I saved your life. Don't make me take it back." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks, but her jaw set with an iron resolve. "My name is Alice," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Alice Whitmore, and I didn't steal that from a stagecoach." "I know," John said. "Josiah doesn't ride stagecoaches, he robs them." "He is my husband," Alice confessed, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "He bought me from my father in St. Louis to settle gambling debts. For 2 years, I have lived in hell. I was his property, his prisoner." John tightened his grip on the ledger. "So, you stole his insurance policy and ran. I took the only thing he cares about. This ledger proves he owns half the lawmen in the Colorado Territory, including Sheriff Tobias Hayes down in Durango. Without this book, his empire crumbles." John paced the small room, the betrayal burning hot in his chest. "You lied to me. You brought the devil to my doorstep." He stopped, his eyes narrowing as the pieces suddenly clicked together into a terrifying picture. He looked at her, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. The stagecoach routes were closed. She couldn't have just wandered up here. The mountain passes were impossible to navigate blindly in a storm. "You didn't just stumble upon this cabin, did you?" John asked, his voice deathly quiet. Alice looked down at her hands, taking a trembling breath. "When I lived with him, Josiah only ever talked about one man with fear in his voice. He had a man tracking you for years. He knew you were hiding in the San Juans." She looked up, locking her tear-filled hazel eyes with his hardened gaze. "I didn't come up this mountain by accident, John Montgomery. I came up here looking for you. I knew if there was one man on this earth dangerous enough to protect me from Josiah Miller, it was the man who wanted him dead just as badly as I do." John stared at her, the gravity of her confession crashing down on him. She had used herself as bait. She had orchestrated this entire desperate gamble, risking freezing to death just to force a collision between two violent men. Before John could respond, the silence of the cabin was shattered. From outside, down the ridge, came the distinct, sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing through the clear winter air, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable sound of horses plowing through deep snow. The storm was over, and hell had finally followed her up the mountain. "Get down!" John roared, tackling Alice to the hard oak floorboards, just as a second volley of heavy lead splintered the thick front door. The deafening roar of Winchester repeaters echoed through the valley, tearing through the frosted windows and sending shards of glass raining down on them like deadly hail. John rolled off Alice, his hand instantly finding his own rifle. He didn't panic. The chaotic symphony of gunfire was a language he was entirely fluent in. He crawled to the hearth, grabbing a bucket of melted snow, and doused the fire. Hissing steam filled the cabin, plunging them into the grim, gray light of the winter afternoon. "They followed the smoke," John muttered, peering over the windowsill. Through the shattered pane, he saw 6 men on horseback, their mounts chest-deep in the snowdrifts 50 yards down the ridge. They wore heavy dusters and dark bandanas, but John recognized the man barking orders at the front. It wasn't Josiah Miller. It was Sheriff Tobias Hayes of Durango, a lawman bought and paid for in blood, whose name was prominently etched in the ledger now resting in John's pocket. "Montgomery!" Hayes's voice boomed across the snow, carrying a cruel, mocking edge. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got Miller's runaway property. Send the girl and the book out, and we'll leave you to your miserable exile. You have my word as a man of the law." John spat on the floor. "Your word ain't worth the tin pinned to your chest, Tobias," he yelled back. He looked down at Alice. She was trembling, clutching her velvet riding habit, but her hazel eyes were locked on his, entirely devoid of the frail victim she had played 3 days ago. "If they get that ledger, they'll burn it. If they get me, Josiah will make an example of me that will take weeks," she said, her voice eerily calm over the ringing in their ears. She reached into her corset and pulled out the polished silver derringer. "I am not going back, John. I will put this first barrel in my own chest before I let them put me on a horse." John stared at her, seeing the iron will forged in the fires of a hellish marriage. The ghost of the girl in Denver had haunted his every waking moment, a victim he had failed to save. Looking at Alice, he realized he had been given something rare in this unforgiving frontier, a second chance. "You aren't dying today, Alice. Neither am I," John said, racking the lever of his Winchester. "Keep your head down." John popped up from the window, leveled his rifle, and fired 3 rapid shots. The booming reports echoed off the mountain. The first shot took a man out of his saddle. The second shattered the shoulder of another. The third sent Tobias Hayes's horse rearing in panic. The posse returned fire, peppering the cabin walls, but John was already moving. "The front is a death trap. They'll try to smoke us out next," he told Alice, grabbing his heavy wool coat, a saddlebag of ammunition, and tossing her the buffalo blanket. "There's a root cellar trap door under the rug. It leads out to the eastern slope. We move now." They threw aside the rug, hoisted the heavy wooden hatch, and dropped into the freezing darkness of the cellar. Above them, the unmistakable thump of a kerosene lantern hidden the floorboards echoed, followed by the rapid crackle of flames. "Move," John urged, pushing open the exterior cellar doors. The blinding glare of the snow hit them instantly. The eastern slope was steep, thick with towering ponderosa pines, and completely untracked. They plunged into the waist-deep snow, every step an agonizing battle against the mountain. Gunfire erupted behind them. "There, on the ridge," someone shouted. Bullets zipped through the pine needles, raining snowy debris down on them. John turned, firing blindly to keep their pursuers pinned, but the sharp, burning bite of lead grazed his left thigh. He grunted, stumbling forward into Alice. "John," she cried, catching his weight. "It's just a graze. Keep moving towards the tree line," he gritted out, the copper taste of adrenaline flooding his mouth. They scrambled down the treacherous decline, the sounds of their burning sanctuary crackling high above them. John knew this mountain like the back of his hand. Half a mile down was the Animas Gorge, a sheer drop to the freezing river below, crossed only by an old abandoned narrow-gauge mining bridge. If they could make it across, John could blow the wooden supports and cut off the pursuit. But as the towering pines finally broke, revealing the perilous wooden bridge suspended over the churning, ice-choked rapids, John's blood ran cold. Waiting for them on the other side of the bridge, wrapped in a black wolfskin coat and holding a customized Sharps rifle, was Josiah Black Eye Miller. The wind howled through the narrow gorge, whipping snow into violent flurries. Josiah Miller stood at the far end of the swaying wooden bridge, a terrifying monument to greed and violence. Flanking him were two more hired guns. Tobias Hayes and the surviving posse members were crashing through the brush behind John and Alice, closing the trap. They were caught in a deadly vice. "Alice, my sweet," Josiah called out, his voice smooth and lethally calm, carrying effortlessly over the roaring river below. "You have caused me an incredible amount of inconvenience. And you, Montgomery, the famous Pinkerton ghost. I thought you drank yourself to death by now." John pushed Alice behind him, raising his Winchester. His leg was bleeding heavily, staining the pure white snow a violent crimson. "It's over, Josiah. I've got your ledger. If I fall, this book goes right into the Animas River. Good luck paying off your judges when your accounts are at the bottom of the gorge." Josiah laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You think she gave you that book for justice, Montgomery? You think she's an innocent victim?" He pointed a gloved finger at Alice. "Tell him, Alice. Tell him who holds the biggest accounts in that little black book. Tell him who sold the Colorado Territory to the railroad barons, using my men to clear the land." John glanced back at Alice. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. "My father," Alice said, the words cutting through the freezing air like a knife. "Judge Henry Whitmore." John's eyes widened. Judge Whitmore was the most powerful man in Denver. He was the man who had assigned John the doomed mission 3 years ago. The shootout that killed the innocent girl hadn't been a botched arrest. It had been a setup. Whitmore and Josiah had orchestrated it to get John out of the way. "She didn't steal the book to run from me," Josiah sneered, stepping onto the wooden planks of the bridge. "She stole it to blackmail her own father, to take the empire for herself. She used you, John. You're just a stray dog she whistled for when she needed a bodyguard." "Is it true?" John asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving Josiah. Alice stepped out from behind him, the wind tearing at her hair. "It's true that my father is a monster. It's true he sold me to Josiah to secure their partnership," she shouted, her voice trembling with rage, not fear. "But I don't want the empire. I want it burned to the ground. I want the men who ruined my life and the men who ruined yours to hang. And the only way to do that was to bring the proof to the one man they couldn't buy." She stepped to the edge of the gorge, holding the heavy leather ledger out over the terrifying drop. "Call off your men, Josiah, or the book drops." Josiah's smug demeanor vanished. The ledger was his lifeblood. Without it, he was just a thug with a target on his back. "Don't be a fool, Alice. I was a fool when I married you," she replied fiercely. Behind them, the brush snapped. Tobias Hayes burst through the tree line, raising his revolver. "Drop the gun, Montgomery!" It all happened in a fraction of a second, the ultimate Mexican standoff breaking into absolute chaos. Alice didn't drop the ledger into the river. Instead, she hurled it directly at John's feet and whipped the silver derringer from her side, firing her first barrel directly at Tobias Hayes. The small-caliber bullet caught the corrupt sheriff in the shoulder, spinning him backward into the snow. Simultaneously, John pivoted. He didn't aim at the men behind him. He trusted Alice. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the searing pain in his thigh, and leveled his Winchester at the bridge. Josiah raised his Sharps rifle, his black eye squinting down the barrel. Crack, crack. 2 shots rang out in perfect, deadly unison. John felt the wind of Josiah's massive bullet rip the fabric of his coat, missing his ribs by a fraction of an inch. But John's aim was true. His bullet struck Josiah dead center in the chest. The outlaw staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock. He dropped his rifle, clutching his wolfskin coat as he fell to his knees on the icy planks, before toppling sideways and plummeting into the dark, churning waters of the Animas River. Seeing their boss fall, Josiah's remaining hired guns hesitated, then turned and fled into the trees, leaving Tobias Hayes groaning in the bloody snow. Silence fell over the gorge, save for the howling wind and the rushing water. John slowly lowered his rifle, his breathing heavy, staring at the empty bridge. The ghost of Denver, the man who had haunted his nightmares for 3 years, was gone. Alice rushed to his side, dropping to her knees and pressing her hands against his bleeding leg. "You're hurt," she gasped, tearing a strip of fabric from her ruined skirt to tie a tourniquet. John looked down at her, the hardened, cynical wall he had built around his heart finally crumbling. She hadn't just survived the storm, she had controlled it. "You're a terrifying woman, Alice Whitmore," he rasped, a genuine, exhausted smile touching his lips for the first time in years. She looked up, tying off the bandage with a fierce tug. "I had to be. May I still warm myself by your fire?" John reached down, picking up the leather ledger from the snow. "Cabin's burned down," he said softly, helping her to her feet. "Guess we'll have to find a new one." In the end, the ledger shattered Colorado's corrupt political machine, sending dozens to the gallows, including Judge Whitmore. John and Alice never returned to Denver. They vanished into the unforgiven frontier, two broken souls who forged a formidable, unbreakable bond in the fires of survival. The mountains kept their secrets, but history whispered of the Pinkerton ghost and the runaway bride who brought an empire to its knees.